Hello and welcome to Investor Analytics. In this third video about VisualVaR, I'm going to be showing how to use the approach to understand stresses to the portfolio. So let's start with a reminder of what the VisualVaR diagram looks like. This first length represents the risk of the first part of the portfolio. This blue arrow represents the risk of the second part, and the portfolio can be broken up into any two parts. This third length, this red arrow, the length of this arrow represents the total portfolio risk. Okay? And what we saw before was that the lengths of these two arrows, well, those lengths are directly related to the amount that we invest in that particular investment and the volatility of whatever it is we're investing in. Those could be stocks, those could be mutual funds, they could be ETFs, hedge funds, etc. The angle that this is drawn at, that's directly related to the correlation. So it's these three things that we can very easily stress using the VisualVaR diagram. We can change the amount invested in either the first or the second part of the portfolio. We can change the volatility. We can change the correlation. So let's see how that might work in practice. So let's start off with a portfolio that is somewhat typical. It has a positive correlation that looks like about positive 0.5, maybe positive 0.6. And there's your total portfolio risk in this case. Let's stress the portfolio by either reducing the amount invested or the volatility of the second part of the portfolio. We can also contemplate increasing the investment or increasing the volatility of that. And let's take a look at what impact that has on the total portfolio risk. And you can very quickly see that it actually changes the lengths of those arrows pretty substantially. Right? Obviously, as you increase more investment or volatility increases, the portfolio risk increases. Now, that is a very different picture from the one that you get if you start off with a hedged portfolio. So let's think about the same type of portfolio, but in this case, correlation is going to be negative 0.5 to start. And so we start with a total amount of risk which is less than the other portfolio. And now let's do the same type of stress. Let's decrease the length of the blue arrow, and let's increase the length of the blue arrow and see what kind of effect that has on the total portfolio risk. And in this case, you can see these red arrows are not materially different in length from one another, whereas these red arrows over here clearly are. So in a hedged portfolio, the volatility of the second investment does not impact the total portfolio risk nearly as much as it does in a more traditional portfolio. One interesting point to note, if we decrease the amount that we invest in that second investment, which is hedging, the total portfolio risk actually increases. So this red arrow, the bottom red arrow, is actually a little bit longer than the one that we started with. And that makes sense. If we reduce the amount by which we're hedging, we're going to increase our risk. Okay, so that stresses to the investment amount. Correlation stresses are rather straightforward. Potentially even more straightforward than the first ones I just showed. And this is going to be reminiscent of what we saw in the second video. Because in that video I introduced a risk compass showing the directional dependence of these diagrams. So if we start with a portfolio like this and we're going to shock the portfolio by increasing correlations, the blue arrow would point this way. If we decrease correlations, it might point more straight up, and if they become negative, it would point backwards. And you can clearly see that has a very big impact on the total portfolio risk. As correlations get bigger, the risk gets bigger, and as they go more negative, the risk decreases, as we already knew, and that obviously is supported by the diagram. Now, what gets really interesting is the combination stresses. Right? So let's start with a portfolio. Let's maybe start with the typical portfolio that has a positive correlation, and let's see what happens when we stress both the first securities investment amount. So let's decrease the amount we're going to invest in that first investment. Let's increase the amount in the second investment. Let's also change the correlations from positive to negative. And in this case, you can clearly see you can construct a portfolio, or you can shock the portfolio and see how the risk will change based on those two shocks, or those three shocks simultaneously, changes to both the lengths of the arrows as well as to the orientation. So that you can literally shock 1, 2, or 3 of these and visually see what impact that has on the total portfolio risk. If you're interested in playing around with VisualVaR for yourself, we invite you to visit www.visualvar.com And there you can construct your own portfolio, and the VisualVaR diagram will be drawn for you, and you can make whatever changes you want to the investment amounts, and it will show you how that impacts the total portfolio risk.